Hi. Just come back from a really interesting lecture at the University of Lincoln, where I was fortunate enough for my colleagues to have a look at my work on neurosis and assimilation and give me some initial ideas, critique, so on and so forth. I tried to record that 2-hour lecture. And I was so excited when I finished, and I looked and thought I'd have it, and my battery died. So I was walking home, neurotic about the conference, neurotic about wanting people to understand or hear my concepts. So I thought, come home straight away and just try and give you the essence of what I'm thinking. Now I find it's all very well writing books about these things, and obviously it's a type of object that demands a process of time and reverie and rewriting, editing. But sometimes I get too bogged down with the words I'm using and too much detail, maybe case studies and things like this. And I've seen the success of so many videos of philosophers and just general kind of curious people talking about issues and things. So I wanted to introduce today my work. Now, this is a two-year-old book now called Neurosis and Assimilation, which came out in the Springer Press, which talks about my kind of outlook on the world, philosophically, psychologically, and then shortly after that, I edited a book called The Neurotic Turn from Repeater Books, which involves essays from other people all over the world, different disciplines, talking about how neurosis as a possible kind of use term or description is still valid today. And also the critical question, why did the word ever become redundant? In the 1980s, it was made redundant. Of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And in a sense, we have a nice metaphor here that the concept, if you like, of neurosis was repressed itself. Yeah, repressed itself from the general landscape of ideas, general discourses on knowledge. Maybe you could see it pop out in things like some fiction writing and film. You've got kind of the anxiety-ridden neurosis of Woody Allen in some ways, or the Patrick Bateman, a different way of being neurotic about how one is perceived or how one succeeds in a certain late capitalist landscape. So they do come out, but the word became quite sparse in theoretical and philosophical discourses around the same time that it was made redundant. And then we have my other term, assimilation. Now, assimilation, people who know me or read me are kind of like, oh, I like your work, but I still don't understand what these two terms mean, So, I'm okay with not understanding. One of the reasons why the concept of assimilation makes sense to me is because the word can kind of operate, at least heuristically, without having to define it as maybe a material, coming from a material ontology or coming from an idealistic ontology. So if something can assimilate, for example, let's think of the crudest example, when I play tennis, I assimilate the tennis court, or the tennis court assimilates me, and I become a tennis player. I'm oriented by the conceptual and semiotic sign systems of the state of play of the activity. I myself become tennis player, so it's not just a description of how we are oriented or navigated conceptually by things, but also how we create an identity based on these things. I become a tennis player. Maybe I drop the tennis racket down and I become Charlie Johns, the writer, or whatever. So we can talk about that form of capture, processes of capture, at least in society, without recourse to. We can bracket off for now in a phenomenological sense. We can bracket off what type of material causes that they may be, or whether such assimilations are caused or made necessary by certain categories in the mind, like camp or something. Yeah? And a friend of mine, Graham Freestone, also started writing on this idea of assimilation as a kind of meta description as well, because if I say, for example, you could say that you are a materialist, and then you'd have some kind of a decision to make there based on that work and the values of that work. And one could simply say one has become assimilated by this form of thinking. One has become assimilated by an idealist camp, a realist camp. One has become assimilated by the idea of Newtonian space-time, and then further assimilations ensue from presupposing those first principles, or those first forms of assimilation. So the question is a skeptical one, in the sense that I'm not saying this is a philosophy of assimilation, this is how it should be. You can use it in a different way by saying every form of decision, perhaps this is a Laurialian thing, every form of decision is already within a framework of meaning. And all I want to say is that there is not a better or worse one. One has to just accept that one is being assimilated by those thoughts. So that's one part of that talk. Right. Well, so where do we come from, or what's the kind of framework for thinking like this, and why should we? I think neurosis, even though it's got me into a lot of trouble by using a kind of word that has a certain meaning use as a larger territory of let's say, the zeitgeist itself, it can get you into a lot of trouble, because it's kind of then saying everything's neurotic. And different levels, we have these problems with earlier philosophers, a kind of monism, like everything is made of this, everything comes from this. Now, I want to get away from that, but I want to explain consciousness, first-person phenomenological consciousness, as neurotic, aptly, because I think, taken from various different thinkers, but let's start with the idea in Heidegger, which is we have that threefold awareness of, in first person consciousness, of both being thrown into a world. So we have concepts that aren't of our making, that we inevitably use. So there's a kind of, we need to be there's a kind of naivety of appropriating concepts, for example, language, to try and express ourselves, yet we do not have a full understanding of language itself. It is in some sense other to us. And obviously other things like dispositions from a certain historical and social circumstances, which allow us to have certain values and morals, ethics. So we have an awareness of the past and of a conceptual apparatus flowing through us. We have an awareness of the present, which I think the present is kind of made into a limiting, pejorative concept, maybe for Heidegger sometimes, in the sense that the present is only a kind of piecemeal, image of something which is actually in flux, or is withdrawing from us, or has different relations with different things. So we have that idea of a present as being the kind of sphere of use of action, and then we have an awareness of future, that these actions and even the past is preparing us or working towards a project, whether it's a large project in society in a general sense, or the project of using a hammer to nail some wood together, because they have a project of building a house for their loved ones to live in, etc., which involves more and more of this relations and equipment. That's all very well and good, but there must be a negative side to that too, maybe, which is there have been ways of decentralizing the subject over the last 100 years at least, and one of the main ways has been to involve the subject in material circumstances beyond our control, or to reduce various forms of autonomy into a web of relations, of processes, geological, historical, social. You could say that psychology does this with reducing the subject to unconscious drives, so on and so forth. But you could also decenter the subject conceptually. I think Hegel does this, even though people see Hegel as a positive philosopher in the sense of the final idea and the resolution of two terms, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But if we start with the phenomenological perspective, the threefold, as I explained, past, present, future, we are very well, we are allowed to say that we're a bit worried about those concepts coming through us. The subject becomes victim to, the subject is in between. If we have this threefold and we're in the present, it's an interesting description to think of the subject as victim to thoughts, going through them. And I believe this is more understandable than the materialist decentralization of the subject, because I think essentially we're dealing with whether these ideas are right or wrong, it doesn't matter, but we're dealing with ideas. We deal with concepts. Even if we have processes that we don't understand, they will be brought into consciousness, or they will have an affectivity in some sense that will be able to be registered. We'll be able to say, I'm scared. We'll be able to understand this. The apparatus of concepts, I think, needs to be seen in this way, in a kind of determinative sense of concepts. And in this sense, we have the traditional idea of the neurotic, a subject which has thoughts whether they like to or not. It's kind of the bad side to the Buddhism, idea of letting thoughts flow through you. And also this idea of being victim to thoughts, or the traditional neurotic being affected by thought, also goes the other way into the future, where we could begin to see, at least especially in 20th and 21st century mass-conformism, that we also have ideas from the outside that kind of assimilate, as I would say, us, and we become agents to work for ideas. We start practicing ideas whether we even know it or not, and suddenly we are voting for this person or that person, and yes, we can have some facts about things, but a lot of the time we don't really understand the facts. We don't understand the processes. We simply are mediating between the processes, and we begin to have disposition, prejudice. We can become obsessed by things. I think this is pointing to this initial idea that I talk about of being sensitive and aware of these concepts that we are channeling, and we are working through and perhaps for, or the concepts are working for us. For example, subliminal advertising captures us and makes us think that we are desiring something. The other side to the threefold, in that Heideggerian sense of the neurotic, would simply be a more psychological, perhaps, definition, which is that in people like Jung and Freud, there's going to be a kind of tension between a general meaning in a society or a function that works, and then something that impedes it, or something within that society that conflicts with it. For example, infidelity or taboo, various things. So Lacan talks a lot about this when we have an idea of the symbolic self, or the imaginary self within the symbolic realm, and sometimes things don't work out for us, and we need to figure out ways of resolving those conflicting problems. X loves Y, but Y has slept with X's brother. You have a desire to love this person, yet it's in conflict because she has betrayed you with your brother. So how do we resolve these two different types of meanings of uses? This could be as subtle as simply reaching for a cup and to use as a cup of tea, to suddenly realizing that the same cup was used to your grandma used to play a game where she'd flick coins into the cup, and she died of a horrible accident. So every time you look at the use of the cup, it brings a conflicting use. Should you use it? Should you not use it? So the antagonisms between what we assign as meaningful. This is the question. This is we enter into a world of meaning, and sometimes those meanings we don't like. We don't want to be integrated into that type of meaning. So an alienation occurs. Yeah. But I think that not only that's a kind of human oriented idea of human and world. I think Graham Harman's right here that there are many other different domains, object to object, and the relations between those kind of things. So let's start thinking about if, for example, you go into a derelict industrial building and there is a do not smoke sign inside. Okay, so there used to be a meaning as use. I'm using the Wittgenstein idea here, where you'd look at that and the concept that we put in it, which is to signal a certain activity or not to do a certain activity, it doesn't matter anymore because it can't be assimilated, or it's not assimilated in the same way. Yet when we still go in that derelict building, we still kind of think, oh, best not, or at least I would if there was if that derelict building had been slightly appropriated and people were drinking in there and watching some music, listening to some music, and I saw the sign, I would refrain from taking a cigarette out. So the meaning as use still stays there somehow. It's in conflict with its environment. So what I'm saying is it's not simply a subject object or subject or subject and social tension between meaning abuses and different conflicts. I think it can happen in the world around us all the time. Even we could say architecture itself, yes, we create it with a use in mind, but you'd have to say that one can't reduce it to human intentionality. It starts doing things with its environment. Some of those meanings were there, some of them weren't. And the interesting thing would be to chart these relations. I used to talk in Neurosis and Assimilation. I talk of a cathedral or church and the different forms of assimilation that still occur. So, for example, an angst-ridden teenager might come into the cathedral and desires to swear or curse and be kind of just quite kind of rude just for the sake of it. And as soon as he goes in, he realizes there is a silent assimilation. No one is swearing. there's a kind of unwritten, law where that kind of thing wouldn't even be disclosed or allowed. So we already found something that is conflicting. Or, for example, when one builds a church or cathedral, they have meaning as uses. They have certain concepts that they have to understand how it functions, but they did not. There are some things outside of those concepts that exist, whether they like it or not. For example, the concept of having to clean the church or cathedral. We didn't decide in the design architectural proofs that we'd want dust and dirt everywhere. It happens. It conflicts with the meaning as use of the environment. And what do? We find a new meaning as use. We employ cleaners. Cleaners become the new resolution of this, and their jobs are for doing this. But it never stops. It never completely resolves. So the relations between environment objects is just as interesting as the psychological one between the kind of healthy, pragmatic subject and the kind of always never resolved society that attempts to integrate. I'm trying to think of what else we could talk about. Maybe that might be enough for now. Yes, I'll come back to some more later. Thanks.